Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, let your thoughts drift gently as we take you on a peaceful journey. This is a space for calm, for quiet moments, and for the kind of stories that settle your heart and slow your breath. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes if you wish, and allow the world to soften around you. Now, let's begin with tonight's story. Today's story is titled, The Light of the Fallen Shadows. Act 1, The Journey to Eldrowin Hollow. The air inside the train carriage was cool and still, a welcome contrast to the summer heat that shimmered like waves outside the window. Elias sat with his backpack nestled beside him, a leather-bound journal balanced on his knees, and a half-doodled map of the countryside sketched on its open page. Across from him, his companion leaned lazily against the window pane, the light catching strands of her auburn hair. "Not much longer now," said Lyra, stretching her arms. "Once we pass through the fir tunnel, we'll be in Eldrowin Hollow." Elias glanced up. "Fir tunnel." Lyra smirked. "You'll see." And indeed, only minutes later, the landscape outside shifted dramatically from sun-soaked meadows to a long stretch of evergreen trees that arched like an emerald corridor. The train slowed as it passed beneath them, shadows flickering over their seats like whispers. Elias pressed his face to the glass, mesmerized. "I told you," Lyra said. "Magic, isn't it?" Elias didn't answer immediately. The quiet beauty of it reminded him of stories his grandmother once told him about hidden places, where time moved differently and people could forget they ever belonged to another world. They arrived just past midday. Eldrowin Hollow's tiny station was more of a wooden platform than a true stop. No one else disembarked, and no one else was waiting. It felt as though the town had been holding its breath until their arrival. The sun was high and golden, casting warm light across cobbled paths, thickets of lavender, and stone houses with ivy climbing up their walls. A breeze rustled the leaves in the nearby orchard, and somewhere, a bell chimed softly. "I haven't been here since I was a child," Lyra said, pulling her suitcase behind her. "But nothing ever really changes in Eldrowin." "Are you nervous?" Elias asked. She paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe. But in a good way." They followed a winding path through tall grass and wildflowers until the town gave way to the outskirts where the land opened into sweeping fields and moss-covered fences. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and a pair of butterflies danced in the air before them. Eventually, a weathered cottage came into view, nestled beneath a sprawling willow tree that swayed in the summer breeze. The cottage's roof was thick with moss, and its wooden door bore a brass knocker in the shape of a fox's head. "This is it," Lyra said. "My grandparents' place. We used to come here every summer before. Well, before things changed." Elias caught the shift in her tone but didn't press. They stepped onto the creaky porch, and Lyra knocked twice. A moment later, the door swung open, revealing an elderly man with kind eyes and suspenders, and beside him, a woman in a sun-bleached apron, her hands still dusted with flour. "Lyra." The woman beamed, wrapping her in a flowery hug. "And this must be your friend." "Elias," he said, offering a slightly awkward handshake. "Come in, both of you. Lunch is nearly ready, and I just pulled a berry pie out of the oven." The inside of the cottage was a dream of cozy corners and forgotten time. Bookshelves bowed under the weight of old tomes. Curtains fluttered in the gentle breeze. The smell of fresh herbs, baked bread, and lavender filled the air. While the pie cooled, the four of them sat on the porch sipping lemonade from glass jars. Lyra leaned her head back against the post and closed her eyes, smiling faintly. "Feels like the world got quieter the moment we arrived," Elias said. Her grandfather chuckled. "That's the hollow for you. It listens. It remembers." Elias glanced around. Even the wind seemed to move with a kind of intent, rustling only the leaves closest to them, as if welcoming them home. And though he would not say it aloud yet, Elias felt something stir in him, something old and soft and forgotten. A sense that this place had been waiting not just for Lyra, but for him, too. That evening, after they'd unpacked and settled into the guest room at the end of the hall, Elias stood by the window and looked out at the horizon. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. The willow tree swayed, whispering secrets only the wind could hear. He didn't know what lay ahead, only that something about Eldrawin Hollow felt different from anywhere he had ever been. And perhaps, in the quiet space between dusk and dream, something was beginning to wake. Act 2, The Cottage of Whispering Roots. The cottage creaked with familiarity, as if every beam and brick remembered Lyra's footsteps from years past. The hallway welcomed them with walls lined with old paintings, soft, sepia-toned portraits of people smiling shyly into the past, eyes glinting with a knowledge long buried. Each door was marked with a small brass nameplate, not with names, but with symbols: a tree, a star, a crescent moon. Elias paused outside the door marked with a feather. "This was always the guest room," Lyra said, brushing her fingers along the frame. "I used to pretend a feather meant the room was where dreams came to rest." Inside, the room was simple: a wooden bed draped in a hand-stitched quilt, a nightstand with a candle lantern, and a large window overlooking the orchard. Light pooled in through gauzy curtains, casting gentle patterns on the floorboards. A small shelf held a curious selection of objects: a jar of marbles, a carved wooden fox, a faded sketchbook. Lyra smiled. "It's exactly the same." Elias ran a hand over the windowsill. "It feels like it's been waiting for you." Downstairs, the aroma of stew and wild herbs drifted through the house. Lyra's grandmother, Myra, stirred a bubbling pot while humming an old melody. Her grandfather, Alden, was polishing an antique weather vane shaped like a crow. He paused when he saw Elias. "You like stories?" he asked, without looking up. "I suppose I do," Elias replied, taken slightly aback. "You'll fit in here, then," Alden nodded. This place is full of them. You just have to listen. After dinner, they all moved to the sitting room, a circular space with high rafters and a great stone fireplace, even though the summer air didn't require warmth. The fire was lit anyway, casting flickers of amber across the room. Elias sank into a chair near the fire, and Lyra curled up on the rug with a mug of nettle tea. Alden took down a box from the mantel. Inside were a dozen keys, each unique, some rusted, others shaped like leaves or stars or musical notes. "These are from the time I mapped the hollow," he said. "Did you know it changes? The land folds and turns if you stay long enough. Trails vanish. Trees move. Even time gets a little flexible." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You mean the geography shifts?" Alden chuckled. "That's the polite way to say it." Myra nodded from her knitting. "Eldrawin doesn't just exist, it listens, it reacts." Lyra leaned her chin into her hand. "I used to believe the willow tree talked to me when I was little." "You were probably right," Myra said, with such sincerity that Elias had to glance at her twice. Later that night, as Elias prepared for bed, he stepped barefoot onto the cool wooden floor of the guest room and opened the window. The orchard outside was cloaked in twilight mist. Fireflies glimmered between branches, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called, a long, wistful sound that echoed like a memory. Then he noticed it. A whisper. Not quite a voice. Not quite a sound. It came from below the floorboards, soft, rhythmic, like wind threading through roots. It didn't frighten him, exactly, but it wasn't a dream either. He knelt, pressing his ear to the wood. "Welcome back." The words weren't spoken, but Elias felt them in his bones. He sat up slowly, heart steady but alert. Something old lived here. Not dangerous, perhaps, but aware. Watchful. And for some reason, it knew him. The moon rose high above the orchard, spilling silver across the window pane. Elias lay in bed beneath the feather-stitched quilt, listening to the lullaby of crickets and distant wind chimes. Yet even in the comfort of that old room, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he'd crossed a threshold. Not just into the hollow, but into something waiting just beneath it. Act 3, The Garden of Forgotten Echoes. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, dappling the floor with soft light. Elias stirred from sleep, the memory of last night's whisper still clinging to the edge of his thoughts. He lay there a moment longer, listening. But the silence now was undisturbed, only the chirping of birds and the creak of the cottage stretching into the day. Downstairs, the smell of toast, eggs, and wild mint greeted him. Lyra was already at the kitchen table, barefoot, sipping tea and scribbling something into a small notebook. She looked up with a grin. "You sleep okay?" "I think the floorboards spoke to me," Elias said, rubbing the back of his neck. Lyra didn't laugh. Instead, She nodded thoughtfully. Yeah. That happens sometimes. Myra was at the sink, humming softly, while Alden sat by the open back door, sharpening a small garden spade. The light behind him framed the doorway like a painting beyond it. A winding path led into the garden, glowing with morning dew. After breakfast, Lyra pulled Elias by the hand. "Come on. I want to show you the old garden." They stepped out into the backyard, the air fresh with the scent of damp earth and lemon balm. The garden was larger than Elias expected, overgrown in places, yet vibrant and full of life. Tall sunflowers tilted their faces toward the sun, and tangled vines curled over stone arches. Wind chimes swayed lazily above, their notes soft and strange, as if tuned to an older scale. "This place is different every time I return," Lyra said, pushing past a lavender bush. "It remembers things. Sometimes I find objects here that I thought were lost forever." Elias followed her through a narrow gate into a section of the garden surrounded by a low, crumbling stone wall. Inside, a circular clearing opened up, and in the center stood a weathered stone pedestal, no taller than a knee. Upon it lay a collection of old items, a rusted compass, a marble with a crack running through it, a locket shaped like a teardrop, and a faded ribbon. "I used to call this the Echo Garden," Lyra said. "Every object here came back to me. Stuff I lost when I was little. Or thought I had." Elias knelt, gently picking up the compass. "This is strange. It's still warm." "Sometimes the garden gives things back," she whispered. "But only if you've forgotten them enough." He turned the compass in his hand. The needle spun, slowly, not pointing north but toward the willow tree in the distance. "What kind of place is this?" Elias asked. Lyra looked at him, eyes bright but serious. "I think this town is more than a place. It's memory. It's what remains when the world forgets." Before Elias could respond, a faint melody drifted through the air, barely audible, like wind through a music box. They turned. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a small figure. A child. Dressed in old-fashioned clothing, eyes pale and unblinking, watching them from beneath the archway of twisted vines. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back and vanished. Elias spun to Lyra. "Did you see that?" "I did," she breathed. "I haven't seen her in years." "You know her?" Lyra stepped forward slowly, her voice distant. "When I was a child, I used to play out here. I had an imaginary friend named Nellie. We made up treasure hunts. She always knew where things were buried." Elias glanced back at the pedestal, then the compass still in his hand. The needle now pointed straight down. Beneath his feet. He dropped to his knees and brushed aside the moss. A small wooden hatch, long hidden beneath the earth, revealed itself, its edges worn and green with age. Lyra gasped. That wasn't there before. With a glance at one another, they pulled it open. Darkness yawned below, and a cool breath of air drifted up, smelling of stone, old paper, and something else, something Elias couldn't name. He looked down the narrow staircase, swallowed by shadow. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra hesitated only a moment before nodding. "After you, dream boy." And together, they stepped into the dark, leaving behind the garden, and walking straight into a place where forgotten things waited. Act 4, the hidden room beneath the garden. The wooden steps groaned beneath their feet as Elias led the way downward, one hand pressed against the damp stone wall, the other holding an old oil lantern they had grabbed just before descending. The light flickered wildly, casting long shadows that danced along the stairwell. Behind him, Lyra moved with cautious steps, her breath shallow. "Are you sure this was a good idea?" she whispered, though there was a strange thrill in her voice. "No," Elias replied. "But I think we were meant to find this." The stairwell twisted once, twice, before leveling out into a narrow corridor carved into the earth. Tree roots coiled above and around them, woven into the stone like ancient veins. The deeper they went, the more the air grew still, thick with the scent of moss, candle wax, and something almost metallic, like time that had been sealed away for too long. They emerged into a chamber no larger than a cottage room. The walls were smooth and lined with rows of cubby holes, each filled with curious objects: parchment scrolls, pocket watches, feathers, cracked glasses, half-burned candles, locks of hair tied with ribbon. At the center stood a stone table, circular, etched with a spiral pattern that shimmered faintly under the lantern's light. Dust lay thick on everything, but the table itself looked recently touched, as if it had been waiting. Lyra stepped forward slowly, her fingers brushing over the spiral. This wasn't just a cellar. "No," Elias said. "It's a vault." He turned toward one of the shelves. There, in the corner, was a faded wooden box with his name carved into it. His real name. Not the one people used casually. Not even the one on his ID. But the one he had only ever heard once, in a dream when he was a child, a dream he never told anyone. He staggered back. "Lyra," he whispered. "It knows us." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I found something too." In her hands was a notebook, bound in green leather, with gold stamped letters, "To Lyra, before you forget." She opened it with trembling hands. Inside were drawings. Pages and pages of them, some in colored pencil, others in charcoal. They depicted her as a child, in places she remembered and others she didn't: the echo garden, the willow tree, the stone pedestal. But some images were unfamiliar: her standing beside a door with a symbol like an hourglass split down the middle. Her standing alone in a forest made of mirrors. Elias stepped beside her. This is impossible. No, Lyra said, closing the book gently. This is Eldrawin. They spent the next hour moving silently through the room, opening drawers, unfolding maps drawn with invisible ink that only revealed their paths under candlelight, and reading letters signed by people who hadn't existed in over a century. Elias found a phonograph with no records. But when he cranked the handle and placed the needle, a voice emerged from the horn, not music, but a message. Memory is not linear here. What you find, you've already lost. What you lose, you've never had. The voice was familiar. His own. Lyra sat down hard on the floor. Okay. Okay. So this is a dream, right? Elias crouched beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. What if it isn't? What if this is the place where forgotten things go? Not just objects, but parts of us. As they sat in the center of the memory chamber, a soft hum began to vibrate through the air. The spiral on the stone table started to glow, pulsing in time with their breaths. Then the chamber shifted. Not physically, but the light warped, like reflections across still water suddenly rippling. In its place, another vision emerged. The room dissolved into a garden, lush, silent, drenched in moonlight, and a figure stood by the willow tree. Nellie. Her pale dress glowed faintly, her eyes still and unreadable. You found the vault, she said, her voice clear despite the silence. Now you must remember what was left behind. Left behind where? Lyra asked. Nellie tilted her head. In the garden. In the hollow. In yourselves. And then she vanished again, leaving only the fading glow of the spiral and the memory of her voice echoing like wind through leaves. The chamber returned to its dim, dusty state. Elias stood up, heart thudding. We're not here by accident. We were brought. Lyra nodded, gripping the green notebook. The hollow is asking something of us. A low, metallic creak sounded from the far wall. A door had appeared. Not built, grown out of the roots themselves. At its center was an inlay carved with the same spiral from the stone table, and just beneath it, a phrase in an old tongue neither of them recognized. But both instinctively understood. Only the ones who remember may open the way. Elias looked at Lyra. Are you ready? She smiled faintly, though her fingers trembled. No. But let's go anyway. Together, they stepped toward the root-woven door. And as the lantern flickered behind them, the vault of forgotten echoes sealed itself in silence, waiting for the next to remember. Act 5, The Door of Memory and Flame. The door of woven roots stood silent before them, its spiral seal now softly glowing with golden light. It looked alive, like it breathed, like it listened. Elias hesitated only a heartbeat before placing his hand on the inlay. The wood was warm, as if it held a pulse beneath its surface. The spiral responded to his touch, lines of fire flickering outward like veins of light. Then, without sound, the door opened. Knots swung unfolded, like petals blooming in slow motion, revealing a passage bathed in amber glow. A soft wind flowed outward, carrying the scent of ash, burnt parchment, and something strangely sweet like oranges scorched by candlelight. Elias and Lyra stepped through. The space beyond wasn't a room. It was a corridor of shifting flame. Not burning them, no heat, no danger, just light, flickering in every direction. The walls pulsed like slow fire, revealing fleeting images within the tongues of flame, glimpses of memories, not their own. A woman crying over an empty cradle. A boy dropping a key into a well. A man walking into the ocean, smiling. Lyra reached toward one of the walls, her hand trembling. The flame curved inward, forming a doorway, and the memory inside bloomed. She saw herself as a child, no older than 7, standing in this very garden. Beside her, Nellie smiled and whispered into her ear. But in this vision, there was a third child. A boy. His face was blurred, but he held Lyra's hand, and the three of them laughed as they buried a box beneath the willow tree. "I don't remember this," Lyra said softly. Elias moved beside her. "But it remembers you." He stepped further down the corridor. More doorways of fire emerged, each showing him different fragments, some familiar, some foreign. One showed his mother, standing in a sunlit field he'd never seen. Another showed a library underground, where pages turned themselves and ink flowed backwards into quills. One doorway, smaller than the rest, showed Elias as a boy, holding a stone shaped like a teardrop. He was standing before a mirror, and on the other side of the mirror was not his reflection, but a girl with silver eyes. He turned away before the flame could swallow him whole. The corridor narrowed, folding in on itself until they arrived at a chamber shaped like a dome. At its center was a suspended orb of fire hovering in the air, spinning slowly, radiating warmth without heat. Around it, 6 pedestals stood in a ring. Upon each rested an object. A feather blackened at the tip. A golden key twisted into a spiral. A child's music box, sealed shut. A mirror, cracked into 3 clean shards. A lantern with no flame. And a coin, impossibly thin, engraved with a symbol neither of them recognized. A voice, low, layered, and ancient, filled the chamber. To move forward, you must choose that which was lost not by chance, but by sacrifice. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Sacrifice. Elias stepped forward, eyes scanning the objects. This is a trial. He reached for the lantern. The moment his fingers brushed it, the chamber reacted, the flame above them dimmed, and the floor pulsed like a heartbeat. A figure emerged from the shadows behind the fire. It wasn't Nellie. It wasn't anyone they knew. It was a version of Elias. Older. Paler. Hollow-eyed. His voice was hollow. Do you remember why you left the mirror forest? Elias froze. What? The figure stepped forward. You let her go. You promised you'd never leave. And when the veil closed, you forgot. But this place did not. Lyra reached for him, but Elias raised a hand. I don't remember, he whispered. The hollow version of him stepped closer. You will. And with that, the flame erupted. Not in heat but in light, flooding the room in a brilliant flash that stole their breath. When it faded, Elias and Lyra were no longer in the dome. They stood beneath the willow tree. Only, it wasn't the same. The sky above was twilight blue, thick with swirling constellations they'd never seen. The tree was taller, its roots spread wide, carved with hundreds of tiny names in languages lost to time. Before them, the ground was dug up. And there resting in the soil was the box from the vision. Lyra knelt, hands shaking, and opened it. Inside was a drawing. Crumpled. Childlike. Faded. 3 figures, her, Nellie, and the same boy from the fire corridor. But this time, his name was written beneath. Elias. She looked at him, wide-eyed. You were here. Long ago. Elias swallowed. I think. I forgot. The willow swayed above them, its branches whispering a language neither of them spoke but both understood in their bones. They weren't discovering Eldruin. They were returning. And what waited beyond the veil of memory was only just beginning to stir. Act 6, The Mirror Forest Beckons. The earth beneath Elias's feet was soft, almost alive, as if the very ground responded to his steps. He looked at Lyra, who was just as puzzled by their sudden arrival. The box that had been buried beneath the willow tree now lay forgotten at their feet, but they had no time to dwell on it. The air around them had changed. The colors of the sky no longer felt familiar. The twilight blue that stretched overhead swirled with shades of silver and lavender, as if the heavens themselves had been rewritten. Before them stood a forest. But this wasn't any ordinary forest. The trees were tall and dark, their trunks twisted in impossible angles, their leaves shimmering with an iridescent sheen. They weren't leaves at all, but glass-thin and translucent, catching the fading light in strange reflections. Each tree seemed to bend inward, as though hiding something, or someone, deep within its branches. The forest whispered. Not with wind, but with voices. Soft, distant, echoing words that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Elias felt a shiver crawl up his spine as the air around them seemed to hum with anticipation. Lyra stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the deepening shadows ahead. This is it. The Mirror Forest. Elias squinted. I don't understand. I've never heard of it before. Because you were never supposed to, Lyra said. It's where things that are forgotten memories, people, promises go. It's why it doesn't exist in your world. Only in mine. Only here. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse as if in response to Lyra's words. Suddenly, a shimmering mirror appeared before them, floating in mid-air. Its edges were like the frame of a picture, curving upward with an otherworldly glow. Lyra reached out to touch it, but Elias grabbed her wrist. No, he said, his voice low and uncertain. I don't think we're supposed to touch it. But Lyra had already taken a step forward. As her fingers brushed the surface, the mirror rippled like water disturbed by a pebble. And then she vanished. Elias rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The mirror shimmered one more time before pulling him in, too. He gasped as the world around him shifted. It wasn't like falling. It was more like being pulled through a veil, everything blurred, distorted, until finally, everything snapped into focus. He found himself in the middle of a vast forest, but this was no dream. This forest was real. The trees here were alive in a way that he had never known. Their bark shimmered with light, and their roots twisted and stretched like living veins beneath the soil. The air smelled of fresh earth, yet tinged with something old and ancient, like a forgotten history waiting to be told. In the distance, Elias saw her. Lyra. But this was not the Lyra he knew. She stood in front of a mirror, much like the one that had brought them here, staring at her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Lyra! Elias shouted, rushing toward her. She turned slowly, and he saw something shift in her expression, something strange, unfamiliar. Her eyes were no longer her own. They were deep and endless, reflecting a world that was not their own. This isn't right, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. This isn't. I don't remember. Elias stepped closer, his heart racing. What's happening? Lyra, come back to me. The Lyra before him smiled, but it wasn't a smile he recognized. It was cold, distant, and far too knowing. You found the mirror forest, Elias. But you can't escape it so easily. She reached toward him, her hand outstretched. Not until you remember. Before he could speak, the ground beneath them trembled, and the trees around them began to shift, their leaves turning into reflective surfaces, mirroring the sky above. More mirrors appeared, each one reflecting different versions of themselves. In one, Elias was a child, sitting beside the mirror he had seen earlier, his reflection staring back at him with a deep, hollow sadness. In another, Lyra stood alone, the boy from their past beside her, though his face remained hidden in shadow. The mirror seemed to pulse with memories that didn't belong to her. Do you see? The reflection of Lyra whispered. Do you remember? Elias reached for her, but his hand passed through the reflection like it was made of mist. I can't, he said, his voice cracking. I don't remember. A sudden rustling broke the silence. From the shadows of the trees stepped a figure. A version of Elias older, his face worn with time, his eyes dark and heavy with regret. Did you really think you could forget? This version of Elias said, his voice thick with sorrow. You left her. You left me. Elias stumbled back, his mind reeling. No. That's not me. That's not how it happened. The older Elias shook his head. It is. You left everything behind. You chose to forget. And now, you must face it. You must remember why you did it. Elias looked at the figure, his heart heavy with guilt, but something in the depths of his soul told him this wasn't the whole truth. This wasn't the full story. We don't have to stay here, Lyra's voice broke through, firm and steady. She stepped forward, the Lyra in front of him suddenly shifting again, this time into a reflection of herself, smiling with kindness, her eyes warm and full of hope. We can leave. Together. Elias nodded, shaking off the doubts that had clung to his heart. He reached for her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch anchor him in the chaos. The mirrors began to ripple around them, as if acknowledging their decision. The trees shimmered once more, their reflections twisting like liquid. Let's go home, Lyra said. And with that, the mirror forest began to fade, leaving only the soft glow of the twilight sky behind them. Act 7, The Return to Forgotten Paths. The world around them shifted like the end of a dream. One moment, they were standing in the glowing, surreal depths of the mirror forest, surrounded by flickering reflections of memories and alternate versions of themselves. The next, the trees parted, and the air grew still. The reflections of the forest began to dissolve, like smoke vanishing in the wind. Elias blinked, squinting against the brightness that now surrounded them. The ground beneath his feet was solid again, a familiar, though worn path beneath his boots. Where are we? Lyra whispered, her voice faint with uncertainty. The path stretched out before them, winding through a dense, fog-laden landscape, but this was not the mirror forest. This place felt more grounded, more real, as if it had always been here, waiting for them to return. I think we're back, Elias said, his voice tight. But where is back? Lyra stepped forward, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fog rolled around them like an ancient shroud, revealing glimpses of ruined stone walls, moss-covered statues, and the remains of what might once have been an ancient town. There were no other people in sight. Only the echoes of what had been. This is it, she said. The forgotten paths. Elias's brow furrowed. Forgotten paths. They're the pathways that lead to the places everyone else has forgotten, she explained, her tone low, as if speaking of something sacred. This is where things go that can't be remembered, but aren't quite gone. It's why people who come here are never the same. As they walked, the atmosphere thickened, and every step seemed to weigh more heavily on them, as if the path itself was a living thing, absorbing their thoughts, their memories, and their doubts. The fog parted just enough for them to see a large, crumbling archway in the distance. It was half collapsed, its intricate carvings worn by centuries of neglect. Above the arch, an inscription glimmered faintly, written in a language neither of them understood. "Do you think we should go through?" Lyra asked, her eyes locked on the gateway. Elias hesitated. The archway felt alive, as if it were a threshold to something far more profound, something hidden beneath the layers of time and memory. But it was clear they didn't have a choice. The arch beckoned, like a whispered promise of answers that they both needed. "We came here for a reason," Elias said, his voice firm. "We have to go through." As they approached, the archway seemed to bend inward, almost welcoming them, and as they stepped beneath the stone, the air changed again. The fog disappeared completely, replaced by a vast, starlit sky. But this wasn't just any sky, it stretched endlessly, a swirling mass of shifting constellations, each star casting a soft, ethereal light upon the landscape. "Where are we?" Lyra asked, awe in her voice. "We're at the crossroads of memories," Elias whispered, more to himself than to her. "A place where paths diverge." Before them, an endless array of pathways stretched out, each one different, some lined with overgrown ivy, others with shimmering lights hanging from the trees. Some paths led to mountains covered in snow, others to oceans as dark as ink. And then there were the paths that led nowhere, dissipating into empty voids. One path, however, caught Elias's eye. It was narrow, overgrown with thick vines, but there was something familiar about it. He felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if his very soul was guiding him toward it. "That's the one," he said, pointing. Lyra looked at the path he indicated, her expression uncertain but trusting. "You sure?" He nodded. "I have to. This path, it feels like it's part of my story. Like it's the one I've been avoiding." Together, they stepped onto the path. The moment they did, the world shifted again. The stars above flickered and dimmed, and the fog returned, but this time, it was different. The fog seemed to wrap around them, pulling them forward rather than obscuring their way. The path began to narrow, the trees growing thicker, their roots tangling together, as if trying to keep them from moving forward. But Elias pressed on, determined. Lyra walked beside him, her hand brushing his arm, the warmth of her touch grounding him in the surreal, dreamlike reality they were in. Suddenly, a sound broke through the stillness, a voice, low and resonant, echoing through the trees. "You've returned." Elias froze. He recognized that voice. He turned, his heart leaping in his chest. A figure stood at the end of the path, a figure cloaked in shadow. The fog seemed to part around them, revealing a man whose face Elias knew too well. It was the version of himself he had seen in the mirror, forest, older, sorrowful, and wearing the weight of time on his shoulders. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Did you really think you could run away from your past?" the figure asked, his voice a mixture of pity and accusation. Elias took a step forward, his mind racing. How are you here?" The figure chuckled darkly. "I am you. The part of you that you tried to forget. The part of you that kept running." Lyra stepped closer to Elias, her presence a steadying force. "What does he want, Elias?" The figure tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "I want him to remember. I want him to remember what he lost and why he must face it." Elias took a deep breath. "What did I lose?" The figure smiled again, this time with a glimmer of sadness in his eyes. "You lost the path. The one that leads to the truth. But don't worry, Elias. You're back now. And this time, you'll have to choose." Before Elias could respond, the world around them began to shift once more. The path underfoot crumbled away, and the fog thickened into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Lyra grabbed his hand. "Elias, we have to go now." And with that, they ran. Act 8, The Choice of Shadows and Light. The world around them twisted again, the very air vibrating with a strange energy. The path beneath Elias's feet seemed to collapse into shadows, leaving him and Lyra standing at the edge of a vast chasm. The fog swirled in the air like mist, thick and impenetrable, masking what lay ahead. Beside him, Lyra gripped his hand tightly, her fingers trembling. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Elias didn't answer immediately. He was still trying to make sense of the figure they had just encountered, the shadow of himself, the version of him that had once been trapped in the very things he was running from. He could still hear the words echoing in his mind. "You've lost the path. But don't worry, Elias. You're back now. And this time, you'll have to choose." Elias turned to Lyra, their gazes meeting. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but also a quiet determination. She trusted him, just as he had trusted her since the beginning. "We have to face it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "Whatever this is, whatever the path is, we have to choose it. Together." They moved forward, their steps slow but deliberate, as if the very ground beneath them were alive, shifting, twisting, and reacting to their every movement. And then, the chasm in front of them seemed to split open. A deep, black void stretched out, far beyond what they could see. But in the distance, something flickered, a faint light, pulsing like a heartbeat, beckoning them forward. "This is it," Elias said, his voice filled with resolve. The choice we make here will determine everything. Lyra nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. What do we choose, Elias? He looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the question. He didn't know the answer yet, but he could feel the pull of that distant light, the promise of something that felt both ancient and new. We choose the path, he said finally, taking a step forward. We choose to face the darkness and the light, no matter what we find. As they approached the edge of the chasm, the light before them flickered again, brighter this time. And with it, the shadows began to shift. Out of the darkness, another figure appeared this time, a woman. She stepped out from the shadows, her presence almost ethereal, as if she were made of light and darkness combined. Her hair was silver, her eyes dark like the night sky. She was both familiar and unfamiliar, as though she were a version of Lyra, but not quite. You've returned, the woman said, her voice soft but filled with power. But the choice you make here will define who you are, who you were, and who you will become. Elias stepped forward, trying to steady his breath. Who are you? The woman smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth, only understanding. I am the choice you have yet to make. I am the light you've been seeking, and the shadow you've been running from. Lyra took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? What choice? The woman's gaze flickered toward the chasm. The path you choose here is not simply a physical journey. It is the journey of your soul. The darkness represents everything you've ever hidden from, every truth you've ignored. The light represents everything you've ever dreamed of, everything you've wished for. But both will require something from you. Elias glanced at Lyra, uncertainty creeping into his chest. What do we have to give up? The woman's smile faded slightly. The price of remembering is always sacrifice. You cannot keep both the light and the shadow without losing something precious. The darkness will require your past, your memories, your regrets. The light will require your future, your dreams, your desires. Choose wisely. Elias's mind raced. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He had spent so much of his life running, avoiding the truth, ignoring the past. But now, standing on the edge of everything, he had to face it. He looked at Lyra again, her hand in his, and he knew that whatever path they chose, they would be facing it together. The woman's form began to fade, but her voice lingered in the air, soft and distant. Remember, the choice is yours. The path will be revealed, but only if you are willing to give something up. With her final words, she disappeared completely, leaving Elias and Lyra alone once more at the edge of the chasm. Elias looked out into the darkness, then back to the light that flickered on the horizon. The path stretched out before him, both inviting and daunting. He knew that the choice was his, but it was not just a decision about where to go next, it was about what he was willing to let go of. He reached out toward the light, then stopped, his fingers just shy of touching it. He felt something shift inside him, an understanding that the future was never truly fixed. It was a collection of choices, moments, and memories, all tied together in ways that were beyond his control. "This is it," Elias said, his voice strong now. "We can't go back. But we can choose to move forward." Lyra nodded, her expression softening. "Together." And so, they stepped forward. As they crossed the threshold, the light embraced them, and the shadows retreated. They were no longer standing on the edge of a choice, they were standing in the middle of it. The path ahead was still uncertain, but now, it was theirs to walk. Act 9, The Path of Light and Shadow. The light enveloped them, wrapping them in a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold emptiness of the chasm. Elias felt a rush of energy, like stepping into a vast, infinite space where time didn't matter. The air around them hummed, as if the very fabric of reality was being rewritten, one breath at a time. They walked forward, but as they did, the landscape around them began to shift. The solid ground beneath their feet turned to shifting sand, and the light dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. Suddenly, the path in front of them split, one side bathed in light, the other in shadow. Elias stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "This isn't what I expected." Lyra looked around, her expression a mixture of awe and confusion. "What do we do now?" The air seemed to hold its breath as the two paths stretched out before them, each leading into the unknown. The light path was brilliant and warm, but it felt distant, almost too perfect. The shadow path was cold and full of mystery, but there was something about it that felt familiar, like a forgotten memory reaching out to them. A voice echoed from the shadows. "You have chosen, but now you must walk the path you have selected." Elias turned, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the shadows seemed to distort around him, making it difficult to see clearly. Lyra's voice broke through the silence. "We have to choose, Elias. The light. It promises something, but it's not real. It's a dream. But the shadow, it's us. Our past. Our fears. Our regrets." Elias glanced at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. "But what if we're choosing wrong?" "There is no right or wrong here," the voice whispered. "There is only what you are willing to leave behind." Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. His mind raced, memories of the past flickering through his thoughts like fragments of a dream. He had run from the shadows for so long, burying his fears, his mistakes, his past. But now, standing at the crossroads, he felt the pull of the shadow path, not because it was easier, but because it was real. He turned to Lyra, her face filled with uncertainty but also determination. She had already made her choice, he realized. She was ready to face the past, to confront the shadows that haunted them both. "I think we need to walk the shadow path," Elias said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Lyra nodded. I'm with you. Together, they stepped onto the shadow path. At first, the path was quiet, the air cool and still, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the silence. But as they moved forward, the darkness seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive. The shadows around them lengthened, curling like tendrils that reached out to touch them, to pull them deeper into the unknown. Elias felt a chill creep up his spine, but he didn't stop. The path was his choice, and with Lyra beside him, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they walked, the shadows began to shift, forming shapes in the darkness. The first shape was a mirror, its surface smooth and reflecting their faces. But something was wrong with the reflection. Elias saw himself, but it was not the man he was now. It was the version of himself that had been lost, the one who had run from the past and buried his memories. The reflection spoke. You cannot hide from me forever. Elias flinched, but Lyra squeezed his hand, grounding him. We're not hiding, she said softly, her voice steady. We're facing it. The mirror shattered, the shards scattering into the darkness like broken glass, and the path ahead cleared. But the shadows were far from gone. They continued walking, their steps slow but determined, until the path led them to a large stone archway, its surface covered in ancient carvings. The carvings were faded, worn by time, but Elias could make out the symbols of memories, of choices, of sacrifices. It was a door, but it was not a door to the future. It was a door to the past. Elias felt a pull toward it, an irresistible urge to open it, to uncover the truth that lay beyond. Do we go in? Lyra asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Elias took a deep breath. We have to. He stepped forward and touched the door. The moment his fingers made contact with the cold stone, the carvings began to glow, their edges lighting up like veins of fire. The door creaked open. Beyond it lay a room, vast and empty, but within its center stood a pedestal. Atop the pedestal was a small, old box, its surface worn by time, but its contents hidden. Elias knew, without a doubt, that the box held the key to everything they had been searching for, the key to their past, to the choices they had made, and to the future they had yet to claim. As he stepped toward it, the shadows shifted again, swirling around him, pulling at his thoughts, at his memories. The voice whispered once more. You must open it, Elias. But remember, the path you choose will bind you to the truth. It will not let you forget. Elias reached out and lifted the box. As his fingers touched the cool surface, the room seemed to collapse around him, the shadows closing in, the light fading into nothingness. The weight of the box was suddenly unbearable, and he felt as if he were being pulled into the very fabric of the past, into the memories he had spent so long running from. And then, as the darkness engulfed him, the box opened. Act 10, The Unraveling of the Past. The moment Elias lifted the box, everything around him shattered. The air thickened, swirling with shadows that stretched out like reaching hands. The stone room dissolved, replaced by an unending void of darkness. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the deafening silence, as if the universe itself had paused in anticipation. Then came the light. It wasn't the warm, comforting glow of the path they had walked. It was stark, blinding, and cold. The very essence of the light seemed to pierce through their thoughts, stripping away the barriers they had built around their memories. Elias's head spun, and his vision blurred. He felt as if he were falling not through space, but through time itself. The box in his hands became heavier, as though the weight of his past had been sealed inside it all along. And then the voices began. Soft at first, like a whisper on the edge of his consciousness, but gradually growing louder until they filled his mind completely. The words were not his own, but they felt painfully familiar, as if they were memories long buried, speaking from the depths of his soul. You cannot escape what you are, Elias. You cannot run from yourself. He staggered, holding the box tighter, his fingers digging into its edges as the voices crescendoed into a cacophony of regret, guilt, and sorrow. Images flashed in his mind: his childhood, his parents, his decisions. The life he had tried so desperately to forget, now crashing over him like a tidal wave. Lyra's voice broke through the chaos. Elias, hold on to me. Elias reached out, and her hand found his, grounding him in the storm of memories. Her touch was warm, steady, everything he needed to hold onto in this swirling sea of chaos. Lyra, what's happening? He gasped, his voice trembling. He could barely see through the storm of images surrounding him, but her face was clear, her eyes full of determination. This is the past, she said, her voice calm but heavy with understanding. We have to face it, together. With that, the world around them shifted again. The darkness parted like a veil, and they found themselves standing in the middle of a familiar scene: an old house. Elias recognized it instantly. It was his childhood home. But it wasn't the home he remembered. This place was dark, cold, and abandoned. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, locked away in a memory he had long since pushed to the back of his mind. Lyra's hand tightened around his. Is this my house? Elias whispered, his heart heavy with the weight of the memories flooding back. It's where it all started. Where I made the choices that led me here. They walked through the house, the air heavy with the silence of forgotten years. Each room was more oppressive than the last, filled with echoes of voices that no longer existed. In the living room, Elias saw the shadowy figures of his parents, arguing in hushed voices. The words were muffled, as if they were being spoken underwater, but the emotion was clear: anger, fear, regret. You can't keep running from this, Elias, the voice of his father echoed, distorted by time and memory. You can't hide from who you are. Elias stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He had heard those words before: you can't hide from who you are. The memory crashed into him, raw and painful. He had heard it in his childhood, and he had heard it again from the reflection in the mirror forest, from the version of himself that had haunted him. I don't want to be this person, Elias whispered, his voice hoarse. Lyra squeezed his hand. You don't have to be, she said softly. You're not the same person you were. But you have to face it, Elias. You have to face the truth of your past. They continued through the house, until they reached the door to the basement, the place where everything had begun to unravel. The door was cracked open, as if waiting for them to come inside. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The door he had never dared to open. The door that had always been locked in his mind. He reached for the handle, his hand shaking. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the door swung open on its own, revealing a staircase that led down into the darkness. Together, they descended. The basement was exactly as he remembered it, except this time, it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with old shelves, each one filled with boxes and forgotten memories. In the center of the room, a small table stood with a single object on it. A mirror. The mirror was different from any other they had encountered. It wasn't the mirror that had shown them alternate versions of themselves. This mirror was cracked, the glass splintered in 1,000 directions. But as Elias looked into it, he saw a version of himself, not the man he was now, but the boy he had been. The boy who had locked away the truth. You can't hide from me, the boy in the mirror whispered. You left me here, Elias. You left me to deal with it alone. Tears welled up in Elias's eyes as he looked at his reflection. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't know how to face it. I didn't know how to be who I am now. Lyra stood beside him, her presence a comfort in the midst of the storm. It's not too late to change, she said softly. You're here now. You've come this far. Elias reached out and touched the mirror. The moment his fingers made contact, the cracks in the glass began to shift, reforming, until the reflection before him was whole once more. He saw the truth. The past he had left behind, the choices he had made, and the person he had been, all of it was there, waiting for him to accept it. With a deep breath, Elias stepped back, turning toward the light. I'm ready, he said. And as the mirror shattered, the shadows around him lifted, leaving only the path ahead. Act 11, The Light Beyond the Shadows. The mirror shattered with a sudden, deafening crack, its pieces scattering into the air like shards of a broken dream. Elias flinched, the weight of the past still heavy on his heart, but he could feel something change in the air around him. The darkness that had clung to him for so long was beginning to recede, retreating back into the corners of his mind where it belonged. Lyra stood beside him, her hand still in his, her grip firm but comforting. They both stared at the remains of the mirror, no longer just a reflection of what had been, but a doorway to something new. What happens now? Lyra whispered, her voice uncertain but steady. Elias took a deep breath, the last remnants of the storm inside him settling. We move forward, he said softly. We've faced the shadows. Now, we need to walk toward the light. The air around them seemed to shift with his words. The cold, oppressive weight of the basement faded, replaced by a warm glow that began to fill the room. The shadows that had clung to the walls retreated, leaving only light in their wake. For the first time since their journey began, Elias felt truly free. But as the light expanded, so did the weight of the choice before them. The path ahead was no longer obscured by darkness, but it wasn't easy to see either. The light was beautiful, yes, but it was blinding in its intensity, and Elias knew that walking into it meant leaving everything else behind. It wasn't just a physical journey, it was a journey of the soul, one that would require him to embrace the future, not as he had imagined it, but as it truly was. Are we ready for this? Lyra asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, though her eyes were full of determination. Elias nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in his chest. We have to be. We can't stay in the past. Not anymore. They turned toward the light, walking together toward the unknown. With each step, the world around them seemed to change. The basement, the house, and the forgotten paths faded away, as if they were never there to begin with. What replaced them was a vast, open expanse, a meadow stretching out beneath a sky that was both bright and endless. It was a place that felt familiar, but also new. It was a place where anything was possible. The ground beneath their feet was soft, like freshly tilled earth, and the air smelled sweet, like jasmine and rain. Elias felt the weight in his chest begin to lift, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe freely. Ahead of them, a figure appeared, bathed in golden light. It was the same figure they had seen before, the woman from the shadows, the one who had guided them through the mirror forest. But now, she looked different. She was no longer a shadow of themselves, but something more, a guide, a guardian, perhaps even a part of the world they had entered. Welcome, she said, her voice filled with warmth and wisdom. You've made it. The light is yours to walk in now. Elias and Lyra approached her, their hearts still heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. But now, it felt different. There was no fear, no regret. Only a quiet acceptance. You've come far, the woman continued, her gaze soft but knowing. But this is not the end. It is only the beginning. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. What do we do now? The woman smiled gently. Now, you live. Now, you embrace the light, the future, and all that it holds. The past has taught you, but it no longer binds you. She reached out, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. The choices you made, the paths you walked, all of it was necessary. But it is not who you are now. The light is not a destination, it is a way of being. It is a way of seeing the world, of moving forward. Lyra looked at Elias, her eyes filled with understanding. We don't have to carry the past with us anymore. Elias nodded, feeling the last of his burdens fall away. No. We don't. The woman stepped back, her eyes locking with theirs. Remember, the light is not without its shadows. You may face them again, but you will always have the choice to walk in the light. It is not the absence of darkness that defines you, it is how you choose to face it. Elias and Lyra stood in the meadow, hand in hand, as the world around them seemed to settle into place. The path ahead was no longer unclear, but it was still full of uncertainty. The future was a vast expanse, and they had no idea where it would take them. But for the first time, Elias felt ready to walk it. The woman smiled one last time before disappearing into the light, leaving them alone in the peaceful, sunlit meadow. Elias squeezed Lyra's hand. Let's go. They turned and walked forward, their steps light, their hearts full of hope. The light ahead of them wasn't blinding anymore, it was simply a guide, a beacon to lead them into the unknown, to a future where they could build a life, free from the shadows of their past. And as they walked, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of stars in the sky, as if the universe itself was watching them, waiting to see what they would do next. For the first time, Elias and Lyra were no longer running. They were walking towards something beautiful, something new, something that was theirs to shape. And the light, the true light, was theirs to embrace. Act 12, The New Dawn. The horizon was bathed in soft pinks and golds as the first light of dawn crept across the meadow. Elias stood beside Lyra, the warmth of the sun beginning to touch their skin, bringing a quiet comfort after the long, tumultuous journey they had endured. The world around them was quiet, unhurried, as though it too was taking a moment to breathe in the stillness. They stood at the edge of the meadow, watching the landscape unfold before them. There were no mirrors, no shadows, only the promise of what lay ahead. Elias took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The weight of the past, the mistakes, the regrets no longer clung to him. It wasn't that the past had disappeared, but he had learned to carry it in a way that no longer hindered him. He had chosen the light, chosen to step into the future, and with Lyra by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. Lyra, too, seemed to breathe in the air with a sense of quiet relief. She glanced at Elias, a soft smile on her face. "This feels right," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It does," Elias agreed, his gaze steady on the horizon. "It's like we've been given a second chance. A chance to build something new." But as they stood there, a subtle unease settled in Elias's chest. The road ahead was open, but it was still unknown. The peace they had found was fragile, and despite the clarity they had gained, they both knew that true peace wasn't about the absence of challenges. It was about how they faced them. The soft wind stirred the grass, and with it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, a voice they both recognized. You've come far, but the journey is never truly over. Elias and Lyra turned toward the sound, their hearts quickening. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was the same voice they had heard before, the one that had guided them through the darkness, through the mirror forest, through the shadows of their own souls. From the edge of the meadow emerged a figure, a woman, tall and regal, with eyes that seemed to glow with ancient wisdom. She was no longer the shadowy figure they had encountered before, but now stood bathed in the warm light of the morning sun. Her presence was calm, powerful, and undeniably familiar. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice steady but cautious. The woman smiled, her gaze soft and knowing. "I am the keeper of the paths, the one who guides those who walk between the worlds of light and shadow." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But what do you want from us? Why are you here now?" The woman's expression remained serene. "I'm not here to take anything from you, child. I'm here to remind you of something important." She paused, her gaze shifting between Elias and Lyra. "The choices you've made, the paths you've walked, they brought you here, to this moment. But that doesn't mean the journey is over. You must continue forward, not just for yourselves, but for the world around you." Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. "What do you mean?" "We've chosen the light. We've faced the shadows. Isn't that enough?" The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. "The light is not just a destination, Elias. It's a journey, a way of being. And with it comes responsibility. You have been given a second chance, yes, but there are others still lost in the shadows. The past you've left behind is not just yours to carry. The world around you is full of memories that need to be faced, truths that need to be acknowledged." Lyra looked up at the woman, her face thoughtful. "You mean, we can't just walk away? We have to keep going?" The woman nodded slowly. "Yes. You've made the choice to walk in the light. Now, you must help others do the same. The world is filled with those who are still trapped in the shadows of their past, in their own regrets and fears. It is not enough to simply escape. You must help guide them." Elias felt the weight of her words settle deep in his heart. He had been so focused on his own journey, on finding peace within himself, that he hadn't considered the greater responsibility that came with his choices. He had been given a second chance, but that didn't mean he could ignore the world around him. "We'll do it," Elias said, his voice resolute. "We'll help them. We'll help anyone we can." The woman nodded, a look of approval in her eyes. "You are ready. But remember, the light is not easy to bear. There will be more challenges, more choices. But with each step you take, you will grow stronger, and you will become the light for others to follow." She stepped back, fading into the sunlight, her figure dissolving like mist in the morning air. Your journey has just begun. And the path before you is waiting. With that, she was gone. Elias and Lyra stood in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The light around them was no longer just a symbol of peace, it was a call to action, a reminder of the responsibility they now carried. They had chosen the light, yes, but the path ahead was not simple. It was full of challenges, full of others who needed guidance, just as they had once needed it. Elias turned to Lyra, his gaze firm. We have to be ready for whatever comes next. Lyra nodded, her expression determined. Together. They walked forward, their steps in sync, knowing that the future ahead was theirs to shape. The world was still full of shadows, but with every step they took, they would bring the light a little further into the darkness. And as they walked toward the rising sun, the dawn of a new world began to unfold before them. Act 13, The Legacy of Light and Shadow. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its warm, golden light over the landscape as Elias and Lyra walked together through the meadow. They had left the familiar paths behind, the ones marked by memories and regrets, and now they were forging new trails, creating a future with their own hands. The light that had once seemed distant, almost unreachable, now felt like a constant companion, warm, guiding, and full of potential. But the world beyond the meadow was vast and unknown, full of shadows that still clung to the forgotten corners of existence. Elias felt the weight of that knowledge press down on him, a quiet reminder that their journey was far from over. As they moved through the open fields, they came upon a small village nestled in the distance, its rooftops peeking out from behind the trees. The village looked peaceful enough, but Elias felt an uneasy twinge in his chest. It was as if something in the air had changed, like a storm was brewing on the horizon. This is it, Lyra said, her voice steady. This is where we start. Elias nodded. The village before them was just the beginning, a single step in the larger journey that awaited them. But it was also a place where they could make a difference. Where they could begin to show others what the light truly meant. As they approached the village, the people began to notice them. At first, it was only a few, but soon, the entire village seemed to be watching them, eyes wide with curiosity and wariness. Do you think they'll accept us? Elias asked, his voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. Lyra squeezed his hand. They don't have to accept us. But we have to show them that it's okay to face the light. That it's okay to walk away from the shadows. They walked through the village, the streets lined with modest homes and small shops. The air was thick with the scent of bread baking in the ovens, but there was an underlying tension in the air, a quiet unease that seemed to hang over the village like a shadow. As they reached the center of the village, they were greeted by an older man, his face weathered by time and his eyes filled with wisdom and sorrow. You are the ones, the man said, his voice low and rough. The ones who carry the light. Elias and Lyra stopped in their tracks. The light. Elias repeated, his heart racing. We don't understand. We're just trying to help. The old man looked at them with a steady gaze. The light is not something that can be given, child. It is something that must be earned. It is something that must be lived. He motioned for them to follow, leading them to a small clearing at the edge of the village. There, in the center, was a stone well, surrounded by flowers and vines. The well had been dry for as long as anyone could remember, and the villagers had long since stopped trying to draw water from it. The well was a symbol of the village's brokenness, a reminder of what had been lost. This is where the light must begin, the man said, his voice heavy with the weight of the past. This is where the shadow first took root. And this is where the shadow must be driven out. Elias stepped forward, his heart pounding. How do we do it? The man pointed to the well. You must face it. You must look into the depths of the shadow and confront it. Only then can the light take its place. Lyra's gaze flickered to Elias. She knew, as he did, that this was the test. The moment that would define their journey, the moment when they would have to prove that they had truly chosen the light, that they were ready to walk the path forward. Together, they stepped toward the well, their feet sinking into the soft earth. As they stood before the dark opening, the air grew colder, the shadows deepening around them. Elias could feel it, the pull of the darkness, the weight of the past that still lingered in the depths of the well. It was as though the shadows were alive, waiting to consume them once more. But this time, Elias didn't flinch. He had walked through the darkness before. He had faced his own shadows, had come to terms with the past. And now, he was ready to confront whatever remained. Lyra stood beside him, her hand clasped in his. They shared a silent understanding, a mutual strength. Together, they had chosen the light, and together, they would face the shadow. The old man watched them from behind, his eyes filled with quiet approval. Elias took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaning over the edge of the well. His reflection was distorted in the water below, but as he looked deeper, the reflection shifted. It wasn't just him he saw, it was a version of himself that was lost, a version that had stayed behind in the shadows. His younger self, afraid, uncertain, running from the truth. The shadows in the well began to swirl, as if they were trying to pull him back, to drag him down into the depths. But Elias held firm, his heart steady as he stared at his reflection. "You're not me anymore," he whispered, his voice resolute. "I'm not running anymore." Lyra stepped beside him, her eyes locked on the swirling shadows. "And I'm with you," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "We walk in the light now." At her words, the shadows began to recede. Slowly at first, but then faster, as if they couldn't bear to remain in the light. The well began to fill with water, the surface rippling with a new vitality. The darkness was being replaced by something more powerful, something full of life, of hope, of renewal. The villagers gathered around, their faces filled with wonder. The old man smiled, a look of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "The light has come," he said softly. Elias and Lyra stood together, watching as the well filled with clear, pure water. The darkness had been driven out, not by force, but by the choice to embrace the light. And in doing so, they had opened the door for others to do the same. For the first time in their journey, Elias felt a deep sense of peace. The past, the shadows, the regrets, they were no longer in control. The light was not just something they had chosen. It was something they had become. And the village, once consumed by darkness, was now a place of hope. A place where the light could take root and grow. Act 14, The Ripple of Light. The village had changed in ways Elias never thought possible. Where once there had been fear and uncertainty, there was now a quiet hope, like the first light of dawn breaking through a storm. The well, once dry and abandoned, now shimmered with clear water, and the air felt lighter, as if the weight of the shadows had been lifted. Elias and Lyra stood at the edge of the village, looking out across the fields that stretched toward the horizon. It was a peaceful scene, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, something they had yet to face. "We did it," Lyra said, her voice filled with wonder. "We've given them hope." Elias nodded, but the unease in his chest remained. "Hope isn't enough," he murmured. "We've only just begun. There's still so much more to be done." He looked at the villagers, who were slowly returning to their daily lives, grateful for the water in the well and the promise of a brighter future. But Elias knew that the ripples of light they had set in motion wouldn't be contained to this small village. They would spreading to the places still hidden in darkness, to the people who had not yet chosen the light. And with those ripples came new challenges. New tests of faith, of courage, and of strength. As they turned to leave the village, a figure approached them from the distance, tall, cloaked in shadow, and moving with purpose. Elias tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for Lyra's. She turned toward him, sensing his discomfort. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice low. The figure drew closer, and Elias could see the outline of a hooded face, obscured by the shadows. There was something familiar about the way they walked, as if they were both a part of the world and yet separate from it. As the figure reached them, they stopped a few feet away, their presence commanding but not threatening. The voice that came from beneath the hood was soft, yet filled with an undeniable power. "You are Elias and Lyra, are you not?" the figure asked. Elias stepped forward, his hand still clasped around Lyra's. "We are." "Who are you?" The figure smiled, though their face remained hidden. "I am someone who has watched you from afar. Someone who has seen the light you carry. But I am also someone who understands the shadows that you think you have defeated." Elias's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The figure lowered their hood, revealing a face that Elias recognized, though it was not a face he had ever truly seen. It was a face from his past, another version of himself, but one that had remained hidden in the deepest recesses of his mind. The figure before him was older, their eyes dark and filled with sorrow, their features etched with years of regret. "I am the part of you that you left behind," the figure said. "The part of you that stayed in the shadows, while you walked toward the light." Lyra gasped, stepping back. Is this some kind of trick?" "No trick," the figure replied, their voice steady and full of knowing. "I am your shadow, Elias. I am the darkness that remains within you, the part of you that has not been healed. And I have come to remind you that the light you carry is not enough to erase the past." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had known, deep down, that the light was not a cure-all. That facing the shadows wasn't as simple as choosing the light and walking away from the darkness. There were remnants of the past that still clung to him, memories that would not be so easily erased. "You can't run from me forever, Elias," the figure continued. "You can carry the light, yes. But you must face the shadows within yourself, or they will consume you once again." Lyra stepped forward, standing beside Elias, her eyes full of determination. "We've faced the shadows. And we'll face them again, if we have to." The figure's gaze softened, but the sorrow in their eyes did not fade. "It's not the light that you must fear, Lyra. It's the shadow that lives in all of us. The choices we've made. The regrets we carry. They are not things that can be left behind. They are things that must be faced, acknowledged, and integrated into the very light you carry." Elias looked at the figure, feeling a deep sense of understanding welling up inside him. He had run from this part of himself for so long, burying the guilt, the fear, the doubts. He had thought that by choosing the light, he could escape the past. But he had been wrong. "You're right," Elias said, his voice steady. "I've been running, but not anymore. I can't run from who I was, or what I've done. But I can choose to be different. I can choose to make things right." The figure nodded, their expression softening. "That is all you can do, Elias. The light is not a destination. It is a journey, a continual process of facing the shadows within and without. And as long as you remember that, the light will guide you." With that, the figure turned and began to walk away, their form fading into the distance. "Remember, Elias. The light you carry is both a gift and a responsibility. It will lead you forward, but it will also test you. The journey is far from over." Elias stood in silence, watching the figure disappear into the horizon. He felt the weight of their words settle into his chest, but this time, there was no fear. Only resolve. He had chosen the light, and now he knew the real challenge was to continue walking in it, even when the shadows returned. "We have a lot of work to do," Elias said, turning to Lyra. "But we'll do it together." Lyra smiled, squeezing his hand. "Together. And with that, they turned toward the road ahead, knowing that the light they carried was not just a path forward, but a way of facing everything that lay behind. Act 15, The World in Shadows and Light. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, and the sky was now painted with shades of purple and indigo. Elias and Lyra stood on the outskirts of a bustling town, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had to do. The light they carried, once so bright, so pure, now felt like both a gift and a burden. They had faced their pasts, made peace with their shadows, but the world around them was still full of darkness, still full of people trapped in their own fears, regrets, and doubts. "This is it," Lyra said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the town in the distance. "This is where the journey really begins." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the town ahead. "I know. We've helped a few, but there's so much more to do. There are still so many out there who are lost." They had spent the past few days traveling, visiting villages, towns, and settlements, offering their guidance to those who were ready to face their own shadows. But for every person they helped, there were countless others still living in the darkness. The task ahead of them felt insurmountable, but Elias knew that they had to keep moving forward. As they entered the town, the streets were crowded with people, men and women hurrying to their destinations, children playing in the alleys, merchants calling out their wares. On the surface, everything seemed normal, even peaceful. But beneath the surface, Elias could feel the undercurrent of fear, of hidden pain. It was in the way people looked at each other, in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way they moved through their lives without truly living. Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're not going to change everything overnight, Elias. But we have to start somewhere." Elias turned to her, his eyes filled with both determination and doubt. "I know. But sometimes it feels like we're just scratching the surface. How can we reach them all? How can we help them when they don't even know they need help?" Lyra gave him a small smile. "One step at a time. One person at a time." They made their way through the town, stopping at various shops and stalls, offering words of encouragement, listening to the stories of the people they met. Some were receptive, others wary, but they persisted. They knew that change couldn't come from force. It had to come from understanding, from showing others that there was another way, that the light was not something to fear, but something to embrace. It wasn't long before they found themselves in the town square, where a large crowd had gathered. At the center of the square stood a tall, imposing figure, a man with a commanding presence. His cloak was dark, his eyes cold and calculating. He held himself with an air of authority, and the people around him seemed to listen to his every word. "This is the one," Lyra said, her voice low. "He's the one who has been keeping them in the shadows. He's the one who has been spreading fear, telling them that the light is dangerous." Elias's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the man's presence, the darkness that seemed to radiate from him. This was the true test, the moment when they would have to confront the source of the darkness in the town. He wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of everything they had been fighting against. "I'll talk to him," Elias said, his voice steady. "We can't let him continue to control them." Lyra nodded. "Be careful. He won't go down easily." Elias stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the man, the crowd parted, their eyes following his every move. The man noticed him immediately, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of recognition and disdain. "So, the Lightbringer has come," the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you think you can change the world, boy? Do you think you can undo what has been done?" Elias met the man's gaze, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I don't think I can change the world overnight. But I know that I can make a difference. And so can you." The man scoffed, taking a step toward Elias. "You think you can just waltz in here, spreading your light and expect everyone to follow you? The world isn't that simple. It's not so black and white." Elias stood tall, his resolve hardening. "The world isn't black and white. But that doesn't mean we can't choose which side we stand on. You've been keeping these people in fear for too long. You've made them believe that the light is dangerous, that it's something to fear. But the truth is, the light is the only thing that can save them." The man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You don't understand. The darkness is power. The light only weakens you. If you embrace the shadows, you can control them. You can be invincible." Elias's heart ached at the man's words, at the twisted belief that had consumed him. He could see the fear in the man's eyes, the fear of losing control, the fear of facing the truth. "I don't want power," Elias said, his voice soft but firm. "I want freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from the shadows." The man stepped back, his face contorting with rage. "You're a fool. The light will never be enough. You can't save everyone." Elias took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling in his chest. "Maybe I can't. But I can help those who are willing to help themselves. That's all any of us can do." The crowd was silent now, watching the confrontation unfold. The man's grip on his cloak tightened, but he said nothing more. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. And then, as if something in the air had shifted, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. The crowd, stunned by the encounter, began to disperse, their faces filled with doubt and confusion. Elias stood there, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He had faced the darkness, and though the man had not been convinced, something had changed. The seed of doubt had been planted. The light had begun to push back against the shadow. Lyra stepped beside him, her hand on his arm. "You did well," she said quietly. "You've started to break the spell. Elias nodded, but the weight of the moment settled heavily in his chest. This was only the beginning. The journey ahead was long, and the shadows would not disappear easily. But he knew one thing for sure: he would not stop. The light was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Act 16, The Battle for the Light. The day was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like the calm before a storm. Elias and Lyra stood at the edge of the town, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before them. The village they had helped was now thriving, the people more hopeful, more confident in their choice to embrace the light. Yet, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows they had once fled were not far behind, waiting to return. "Do you feel it?" Elias asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Lyra glanced at him, a soft frown on her face. "The tension." "Yes, I do." "It's not over." "Not yet." Elias nodded, his gaze sweeping across the village. The sunlight bathed the town in a warm glow, but he could sense the underlying currents of fear that still lingered. The man he had confronted in the town square, the one who had tried to spread the darkness, hadn't been the last of the shadows. No, Elias knew that there were more, that there were forces working in the darkness to pull people back, to convince them that the light was a lie. "The darkness never truly leaves," Elias murmured. "It's always there, lurking, waiting for a crack in the light to slip through." Lyra's voice was firm. "But it won't get through. Not if we keep fighting." They turned their gaze toward the edge of the village, where the land stretched out toward the forest. There, standing in the distance, was the figure they had seen before, the man who had embodied the darkness, the one who had tried to keep the village in fear. But now, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood others, cloaked figures that seemed to melt into the shadows, their faces hidden. "They're coming," Elias said, his tone grim. "The shadows aren't going to give up so easily." Lyra clenched her fists, her expression hardening. "Then we'll stand against them. Together." Elias met her gaze, feeling the weight of the responsibility they carried. The light they had brought wasn't just a gift, it was a challenge. It was a beacon that would attract those who thrived in darkness, those who feared the truth, those who feared change. "We've fought the shadows within ourselves," Elias said, his voice steady. "Now we fight for the world." Lyra nodded, her eyes unwavering. "We won't let them take it back. We won't let them take the light." Together, they walked toward the figures at the edge of the village, their steps firm and resolute. As they neared, the cloaked figures parted, revealing the man who had tried to keep the village in fear. His eyes were dark, his face shadowed by the hood of his cloak, but there was no mistaking the hate that burned in his gaze. "You think you've won?" The man sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you've brought light to this place? You're fools. The darkness will always return." Elias stood tall, his voice unwavering. "The darkness can't control us anymore. We've chosen the light. The man stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. The light is nothing but an illusion. It blinds you. It makes you weak. It tricks you into believing that you can change the world, that you can escape the shadows. But you can't. The shadows are part of you, part of everything. You can't outrun them. You can't defeat them. Elias shook his head. We've faced our shadows. We know what we are. But we also know that we are more than our past. We are more than the darkness that tries to pull us down. Lyra stepped forward, her voice strong. You are wrong. The light isn't an illusion. It's the truth. And we'll fight for it. We'll fight for everyone who wants to see the truth. The man's eyes flared with fury. Then prepare to face the consequences of your choice. You think you can just walk away from the shadows. The price of your light will be higher than you can imagine. With a swift motion, he raised his hands, and the shadows around him began to writhe and twist, forming into dark, monstrous shapes that seemed to reach for Elias and Lyra. The air grew thick with the oppressive weight of fear, and the ground beneath them trembled. Elias and Lyra stood their ground, their bodies tense but resolute. They knew that this battle wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be won in a single moment. But they also knew that the light they carried was stronger than the darkness that threatened to overwhelm them. Elias raised his hand, and the light around him began to pulse, steady and bright. We will not be swayed by fear, he said, his voice filled with determination. We will stand firm in the light. Lyra's hand reached out, and the light around them intensified, a radiant shield forming between them and the shadowy figures. The darkness recoiled, as if unable to touch the purity of the light they carried. Together, Elias said, his voice low but powerful. With that, they released the light, and the shadows were pushed back, but the battle was far from over. The dark figures shrieked, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke, but they kept coming, more of them, more shadows, more fear. The darkness was relentless. But Elias and Lyra fought on. They knew that the light they carried was not just for themselves, it was for everyone who had ever been trapped in the darkness. And with each step they took, with each wave of light they sent out, the shadows grew weaker. The battle raged on, but Elias and Lyra didn't falter. They fought side by side, their bond stronger than ever, knowing that the light they had found within themselves was the key to driving the darkness away, not just for them, but for the entire world. And in the distance, the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, casting the world in a soft, golden glow. Act 17, the dawn of a new era. The world was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. Elias and Lyra stood in the heart of the battlefield, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. The shadows that had once overwhelmed them were now nothing more than wisps, dissipating into the air, retreating into the corners of the world where they could no longer hold sway. The village they had saved now lay in the distance, bathed in the light of the new dawn. but the peace that had come so suddenly felt fragile, like a delicate flower opening its petals for the first time, unsure of the world it had been born into. Elias took a deep breath, the fresh morning air filling his lungs. It was a strange feeling, standing here after everything they had gone through, the trials, the battles, the decisions that had shaped them both. It felt like they had won, but at what cost? "We did it," Lyra said quietly, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "The light. It's here." Elias nodded, though doubt lingered in his chest. "We pushed the darkness back, but is that enough?" He looked out over the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds. "Can we really build something new from all this?" Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. "We can't build anything if we keep looking back at what's been lost. We have to look ahead, Elias. The future is ours to create." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that echoed deep in his heart. He had spent so long running from his past, from the choices he had made, but now, standing here in the quiet aftermath of the battle, he realized that the past could no longer define him. It was time to look ahead, time to rebuild, to create a world where the light they had fought for could grow. "I'm ready," Elias said, his voice steady, the doubt in his chest slowly fading away. "We're ready." Together, they turned and walked toward the village, the weight of the world slowly lifting from their shoulders. But as they approached, they could feel the eyes of the people upon them, the villagers who had been waiting, watching. They had saved them from the darkness, but now the real challenge began. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of daily life replaced by a tense silence. People stepped aside as Elias and Lyra walked through, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and fear. They had faced the shadows, yes, but the light was still new to them. It was still something they didn't fully understand, something they were unsure how to embrace. As they reached the town square, the same figure they had encountered before, the one who had embodied the darkness, stepped forward, his eyes still filled with hatred, but now, there was something else. There too. Something more complicated, more vulnerable. "You," he spat, his voice filled with disdain. "You think you've won. You think you've brought the light to this place. But you don't understand what you're dealing with. The darkness never truly leaves. It just waits." Elias stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "The darkness doesn't control us anymore. We've chosen the light, and we'll keep choosing it." The man sneered, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like doubt. "You think you can change the world with your light? You think you can make people forget what they've lost, what they've been through? The darkness is in all of us. It's not something you can simply wish away." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes burning with determination. "We're not here to erase the past. We're here to give people a chance. A chance to choose something better. A chance to build something new. The man's face twisted with a mix of anger and despair. And what happens when the light fades? When the shadows return? What will you do then? Will you fight them again? Will you keep fighting until you've destroyed everything? Elias's heart clenched, but he didn't flinch. He knew what the man was trying to do. He was trying to make them doubt themselves, to make them question their choice. But they had already made that choice. The light doesn't fade, Elias said, his voice firm. It grows. And when the shadows come, we'll face them again. Together. But we will never stop fighting for the light. The man stared at him, his gaze filled with something that was almost sadness, before he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the distance. Elias and Lyra stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling in. The man had not been defeated, he had not given up. But in his eyes, Elias had seen something that gave him hope, doubt. Doubt that the darkness would always win. Doubt that the light was just a fleeting illusion. Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch a reminder of their bond. We can't make everyone believe, Elias. But we can show them the way. Elias nodded, the determination returning to his chest. We'll keep showing them. We'll keep walking in the light, and maybe, just maybe, the world will follow. And so, with the first light of dawn breaking through the clouds, they turned back toward the village, ready to begin the long process of rebuilding. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges they could not yet imagine, but they knew that as long as they stood together, the light would guide them forward. The darkness would always be there, lurking in the corners of the world, waiting for a moment of weakness. But Elias and Lyra had faced it once, and they would face it again. For now, the light was theirs to carry. And with it, they would rebuild the world. Act 18, The Trial of Light. The village had started to rebuild, but not without its struggles. The people, once united in their choice to embrace the light, were now divided. The changes had come too quickly, and with them, questions had begun to rise. Not everyone was ready to accept the light as a permanent solution, not everyone believed that the darkness had truly been vanquished. And those who were uncertain looked to the shadows, which had always been a part of their world. Elias and Lyra stood at the edge of the village, watching the fields stretch out beneath the rising sun. The village was quiet now, but there was a tension in the air, something that Elias could feel in his bones. The light they had fought for, the light they had promised would change everything, was now being questioned. And with that questioning, came the first signs of rebellion. "They're restless," Lyra said, her voice soft but firm. She had sensed it too, the way the people moved through the streets, the way they avoided eye contact, as if they were afraid of something they couldn't name. "I know," Elias replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When we brought the light here, we thought we could change everything, but not everyone is ready for it. Some people, maybe even most of them, don't want to let go of the darkness. They don't want to face the truth of their own pasts. Lyra stepped closer to him, her hand brushing his. We knew this wouldn't be easy. We knew there would be resistance. But we've come this far. We can't let the shadows reclaim what we've built. Elias nodded, though his heart was heavy with doubt. But what if they're right? What if the light isn't enough? What if we can't change things, no matter how hard we try? Lyra turned to him, her eyes full of determination. The light is enough. But it's not just about us. It's about the people. And the only way we can prove that the light is worth fighting for is by showing them. By standing up to the darkness, not just in the world, but in ourselves. Her words gave him the strength he needed. Elias knew what they had to do. The light they carried wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility. And it was time to prove that they could hold on to it, even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. We'll show them, Elias said, his voice resolute. We'll prove that the light is worth it. That it's stronger than the darkness. Lyra smiled at him, squeezing his hand. Together. As they walked back toward the center of the village, they saw the tension that had been building. A group of villagers had gathered in the square, their voices rising in anger and fear. At the center of the group stood a familiar figure, the man who had first tried to turn the village against the light. His eyes were filled with hatred, but there was something else there, too, something that resembled regret. You think you've won, don't you? He called out to Elias and Lyra as they approached, his voice filled with venom. You think you've brought peace, but you're wrong. The light is nothing but a false hope. It will fade. It always fades. Elias stepped forward, his voice steady. You're wrong. The light doesn't fade. It only grows stronger. The man scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You can't escape the truth. The shadows will always return. They're in all of us. You can't hide from them. Lyra stepped forward beside Elias, her presence unwavering. We don't need to hide from the shadows. We've faced them. We've chosen to stand in the light, and we'll keep standing in it, no matter what. The man's eyes flickered with doubt, but he quickly masked it with anger. You think you can convince them all? You think you can make them forget what they've lost? Elias's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. We can't make anyone forget. But we can show them that the light isn't something to fear. It's something to embrace. At that moment, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, a low rumble that spread through the village. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that made Elias's skin prickle. He looked up, his heart racing. The sky above them darkened, clouds swirling like a storm had gathered on the horizon. It's starting, Lyra whispered, her voice tinged with fear. The man turned, his face twisted in both rage and fear. You think you can fight this? The shadows have always been here. And they'll never leave. Elias's gaze hardened. We'll fight, no matter what. The shadows began to stir, rising up from the ground like living things. They twisted and writhed, reaching toward the villagers who had gathered in the square. The darkness was alive, and it was hungry. But Elias stood firm. The light they had brought, the light they had fought for, was not going to be snuffed out so easily. He raised his hand, feeling the warmth of the light surge within him. The villagers watched, their eyes wide with fear and hope. Some of them were still unsure, still trapped in the darkness of their own doubts, but others were ready. Lyra's hand reached out to him, and together, they released the light, a brilliant beam of energy that cut through the gathering darkness. The shadows shrieked, recoiling from the light as if it burned them. For a moment, the square was filled with nothing but light and shadow, a battle between the two forces that had been warring inside them all. And then, with a final burst, the darkness was pushed back, retreating into the corners of the village, where it had come from. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the battle now over, but the cost was clear. Elias and Lyra knew that the darkness would always return in some form, but now they also knew that they were ready to face it. We've proven it, Elias said, his voice filled with both relief and resolve. The light is stronger. And as long as we stand together, the shadows will never win. Lyra smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride. Together, always. And as the sun broke through the clouds, casting its light across the village, Elias and Lyra knew that this was just the beginning of a new era. An era where the light would continue to grow, and the shadows, though they would always be a part of them, would never again hold dominion. Act 19, The Echoes of the Past. The world seemed to have settled into an uneasy peace after the battle. The light was still strong, but Elias and Lyra both knew that the shadows had not been vanquished completely. They had only been pushed back, and the echoes of the past still haunted the corners of the world. The villagers, though free from the immediate threat of darkness, were still unsure, still divided between the light and the shadows they had always known. But the real challenge, Elias felt, was not the resistance of the people, it was the weight of their own pasts. The darkness they had fought was not just external, it was internal as well. They had faced it together, but Elias knew that the echoes of their pasts, of all that they had done and left undone, would continue to reverberate in their hearts until they were faced head-on. He had been running from his past for so long, and now, there was nowhere left to run. The decisions he had made, the things he had buried deep within himself, would have to be confronted if he was ever to truly embrace the light. Lyra seemed to sense his unease as they walked through the village, the streets now quieter, less bustling than before. It was as if the village was waiting for something, waiting for them to take the next step. Elias, Lyra said, her voice soft. I can feel it, too. The weight of it all. It's like we've done so much, but we're still not free. Elias glanced at her, his heart aching. It's not just the village. It's everything. The darkness doesn't just go away, Lyra. It leaves a mark. On us. On everything we built. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. The past is never really gone, is it? It stays with us, no matter how hard we try to forget. Elias stopped, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The warmth of the day was fading, replaced by the cool, biting air of evening. He felt the weight of it, the weight of everything they had fought for and everything they had lost. We can't ignore it forever, Elias said quietly. The past. Our past. Lyra stood beside him, her presence a steadying force. We don't have to ignore it. We just have to face it. Together. Elias turned to her, his heart swelling with a mixture of fear and gratitude. But what if facing it means losing everything we've gained? What if the shadows in us are too strong? Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm and reassuring. We've already faced so much, Elias. We've come this far. I believe in us. I believe in you. Her words, simple as they were enough to give him the courage he needed. Elias knew that their journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The light they had fought for was still young, and the shadows that clung to it would not be easily banished. But together, they could face whatever came next. Together, they could rebuild not just the world around them, but themselves as well. We'll face it, Elias said, his voice steady. We'll face everything. With that, they began walking toward the edge of the village, where the land stretched out toward the mountains in the distance. The path ahead was uncertain, but Elias knew one thing for sure: they could not run from the past any longer. It was time to confront it, to face the echoes that had been haunting them both. As they walked, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. The village, once filled with life, now seemed distant, as if they were walking away from it. But Elias didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. They reached the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and imposing, their dark trunks and twisted branches creating a labyrinth of shadows. It was here, in the depths of the forest, that the echoes of their pasts had been waiting for them. Elias paused, his hand resting on a tree as he stared into the darkness. This is it. This is where it all started. Where I started running. Lyra stepped up beside him, her presence grounding him. We don't have to run anymore. We can go forward, together. He nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping into the forest. The darkness seemed to welcome him, but this time, he didn't shrink away. He stepped into it, knowing that he had to face it. The further they went into the forest, the darker it became, the shadows pressing in on them like a living thing. The silence was oppressive, and every step they took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness. And then, ahead of them, they saw it, a clearing, bathed in an eerie, silver light. At the center of the clearing was a stone circle, ancient and worn, its edges covered in moss and vines. Elias felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He knew this place. He had been here before, in his dreams, in his memories. This was where it had all begun. "We have to go in," Lyra said, her voice firm but filled with concern. Elias nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. This was it. The place where the past would meet the present, where the shadows would finally reveal their truth. Together, they stepped into the circle, and the moment they did, the world seemed to shift. The air grew thick with the weight of memories, and Elias's mind was flooded with images of the past, of the choices he had made, of the things he had done and left undone. He saw the faces of the people he had hurt, the people he had abandoned. He saw the darkness in himself, the fear that had driven him to run. But he also saw something else, the light that had begun to grow within him, the light that had been there all along, buried beneath the shadows. "This is it," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "This is where it all comes together." Lyra's hand found his, steadying him. "You're not alone, Elias. We've faced the darkness before. And we'll face it again. Together." The shadows began to swirl around them, their tendrils reaching out like hands, pulling at their memories, their regrets. But Elias stood firm, his heart strong in the light he carried. He had faced his own darkness, and now, he would face it once more. "This is the last time," Elias said, his voice filled with resolve. "We'll face it together, and then we'll move forward. No more running." And as the shadows closed in, Elias and Lyra stood side by side, ready to confront the past and finally set it free. The dawn of a new beginning. The world was quieter now, the air filled with the first whispers of a new dawn. The darkness that had once loomed over the land, threatening to swallow everything in its path, was no longer a looming specter. The village, the place that had once been filled with fear and doubt, was now a sanctuary alive with hope, its streets bustling with the light of a future they had all fought for. Elias stood at the edge of the village, gazing out over the fields that stretched toward the horizon. The sunlight bathed the earth in a soft, golden glow, the morning air crisp and fresh. It was the first morning in a long time where he could truly say that peace had settled in his heart. He had faced his shadows, confronted the darkness within himself, and now, for the first time in years, he felt truly free. Beside him, Lyra stood in silence, her gaze far off, as if lost in thought. Her hand found his, and together, they stood in quiet understanding, knowing that everything they had worked for had brought them here to this moment. "The past feels so far away now," Elias said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Lyra nodded, her eyes soft as she turned to him. "It does. But it's not gone. It's a part of us." Always will be. Elias glanced at her, his expression serious. I used to think that leaving the past behind would make everything easier. But now I see. It's not about leaving it behind. It's about making peace with it, accepting it as part of who we are. Lyra smiled softly, her hand gently squeezing his. And learning to move forward, not in spite of the past, but because of it. They walked together toward the heart of the village, where the people had gathered for the celebration of the new day. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, music, and the hum of life. The village had transformed, just as they had. The people were no longer living in the shadows of fear and doubt. They were embracing the light that Elias and Lyra had shown them, walking side by side toward a future full of possibility. As they approached the square, the villagers greeted them with warm smiles, their faces no longer filled with suspicion but with gratitude and hope. It had been a long road, but together, they had built something new, something that couldn't be taken away. The old man, the one who had first spoken of the light and the shadows, stood at the center of the crowd, his hands raised in greeting. He had been one of the first to embrace the light, and his transformation mirrored that of the village itself. You've done it, the old man said, his voice filled with pride. You've brought the light back to this world. Elias stepped forward, his gaze steady. No, we didn't do it alone. We all did this together. Every person who embraced the light, who faced their own shadows, helped build this. Lyra smiled, her eyes meeting Elias's. We all have a part to play in this world. We can't change everything overnight, but we can take the steps that matter. The old man nodded, his eyes twinkling. The light is a gift, yes, but it is also a responsibility. A responsibility we must all carry. Elias turned to face the villagers, their faces full of hope. The journey is far from over, he said, his voice filled with conviction. But we've made the first step. Together, we'll continue to walk in the light, and we'll face the darkness when it returns. We'll face it not with fear, but with the strength that comes from choosing the light every day. Lyra stepped up beside him, her hand in his. The shadows will always be a part of the world, but they will never define us again. We've learned that the light isn't just something to follow, it's something we can all carry within us. And together, we will make this world brighter. The villagers erupted in applause, their cheers filling the square as the sun broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant light over everything. The light was not just a symbol, it was a living force, one that had the power to change the world, as long as they chose to carry it. Elias and Lyra stood there, hand in hand, watching as the people around them celebrated. It was a new beginning, not just for the village, but for the world itself. The darkness would always be there, lurking in the corners of the world, but it no longer had the power to control them. They had chosen the light, and in doing so, they had chosen to be free. As the day unfolded, Elias felt the weight of his past lift completely. The shadows that had once defined him, that had once consumed him, were now nothing but memories, lessons learned, but no longer chains that held him back. He turned to Lyra, his heart full of gratitude. "We did it," he whispered. Lyra smiled, her eyes bright with the promise of the future. "We did it? Together?" And as they looked out over the village, bathed in the light of a new day, Elias and Lyra knew that this was just the beginning. They had built something new, something that would grow stronger with each passing day. The world was no longer defined by shadows. It was defined by the light they carried within them. The future was theirs to create.